October 3, 1944. USS Enterprise, CV-6, 180 miles northeast of Formosa. The deck pitches 12 degrees to starboard. Salt spray cuts across the flight deck like buckshot. Wind screams at 30 knots, gusting to 40, tearing at tie-down. Cables and whipping steam from the catapults into ghosts that vanish before they form. The carrier plows through 15-foot swells, her bow rising, slamming down, rising again in a rhythm older than war itself. Above, the sky is ink and iron. Low clouds pressing down like a ceiling too close, visibility measured in hundreds of yards, not miles. Flight operations should have been scrubbed hours ago. But this is October 1944, and the invasion of Leyte looms. And every plane matters, every sortie counts, every pilot must land regardless of conditions, because the alternative is ditching in seas that swallow men whole. On the approach, Lieutenant Howard Smoke. Henderson throttles back his Hellcat, gear down, flaps extended, wrestling the stick as wind shear tries to slam him into the ocean. His fuel gauge reads empty, has read empty for the past 20 minutes. The engine coughs. He can see the deck, a postage stamp of gray steel heaving like a living thing. The LSO, landing signal officer, standing at the port edge with his paddles. A tiny figure in yellow vest and goggles, arms moving in signals that Henderson can barely track through the rain and spray, and the tunnel vision of exhaustion. Cut engine. Drop. Hook catches wire. Or hook misses, and you slam into the barrier, or skid off the deck, or cartwheel into the island superstructure, or explode, or all of the above. Henderson has done this 47 times. He has watched 11 men die doing it. He is 23 years old. The LSO's paddles go crossed, cut engine, and Henderson chops throttle, drops the nose, and the Hellcat falls toward the deck like a stone with wings. The landing gear slams onto steel. The tail hook screeches across. The deck, missing the first wire, missing the second, catching the third with a jolt that snaps Henderson's head forward and tears the breath from his lungs. The Hellcat shudders to a stop 15 feet from the barrier. He made it. Again. But behind him, the next plane does not. By the autumn of 1944, carrier aviation had become the backbone of the United States Navy's offensive power in the Pacific. The Japanese fleet, crippled at Midway and bled white at the Philippine Sea, could no longer contest American air superiority. The carriers, Essex, Enterprise, Lexington, Intrepid, Yorktown, ranged across the Pacific like mobile air bases, launching strikes against fortified islands, hunting submarines, providing cover for amphibious assaults. Naval aviation had evolved in 3 years from experimental curiosity to the most potent weapon in the American arsenal. But it was killing its own pilots. Not in combat, though combat took its share, but in the landing, the approach, the recovery. That final, desperate 30-second ballet of throttle and stick, and prayer that ended with either a successful trap or a fireball on the deck. By late 1944, the statistics were damning. For every pilot killed in action, nearly 2 more died. In deck crashes, the carrier approach was more dangerous than facing enemy fighters, more dangerous than anti-aircraft fire, more dangerous, in many squadrons, than the missions themselves. The mathematics were brutal. The average carrier pilot, after completing training, had a 25% chance of dying in a deck accident before ever seeing combat. For every 100 pilots assigned to a carrier group, 25 would be dead within 6 months. Not from enemy bullets, but from missing a wire, stalling on approach, misjudging altitude, clipping the ramp, or any of 1,000 other errors that turned 5 tons of aircraft into shrapnel and fire. The Navy called it operational attrition. The pilots called it murder, and no one knew how to stop it. The problem was deceptively simple. Landing a plane on a carrier deck is not like landing on an airfield. An airfield does not move. It does not pitch, roll, or yaw. It does not generate turbulence from its own motion. It is not surrounded by ocean. It does not require you to catch a wire with a tail hook at precisely the right angle and speed while compensating for wind, deck movement, your own exhaustion, and the fact that you are flying a machine that weighs as much as a truck and wants to stall if you breathe on the throttle wrong. The technique, as taught in 1944, was called the power-off approach. The pilot would descend toward the deck, throttle back, cut the engine on signal from the LSO, and glide the final seconds onto the landing surface. The theory was sound. Reduce engine power to reduce speed. Commit to the landing. Trust gravity and momentum to bring you down. In practice, it was a nightmare. Cut power too early, and you stalled, dropping like a brick onto the ramp or into the sea. Cut too late, and you came in hot, missing the wires, slamming into the barrier or careening off the deck. The margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. The pilot had no second chance, no go-around, no opportunity to add power and climb away if things went wrong. Once the engine was cut, physics took over, and physics was unforgiving. And the carrier deck was not static. It moved. In rough seas, it could drop 15 feet in the time it took a plane to descend the final 50. The LSO could signal corrections, but the pilot had to execute them with reflexes faster than thought. Hesitate, and you died. Overcorrect, and you died. Misjudge the deck's motion by a single foot, and you died. The instructors, the manuals, the training films all insisted, this is the way. Cut power. Glide in. Trust the system. And the system was killing 25 out of every 100 pilots. Lieutenant Commander George Duncan did not look like a revolutionary. He was 31 years old, a stocky man with a square jaw and thinning hair, originally from Iowa, a farmer's son who had learned to fly in college on a whim and discovered he was good at it. By 1944, he was a senior LSO aboard the USS Lexington, responsible for guiding planes onto the deck, for reading wind and sea and pilot skill in the space of seconds, for making the split-second decision to wave off a bad approach or signal the Ichititu, cut. He had watched, over 18 months, 114 men die on his watch. Not all were his fault. Most were not. But he had stood on that platform, paddles in hand, and watched them come in too fast, too slow, too high, too low. He had signaled the cut and seen them drop into the ramp. He had waved them off and watched them stall and cartwheel into the sea. He had seen pilots so exhausted, so frayed, that they froze on approach, unable to process his signals, flying on instinct and terror until instinct failed, and terror was not enough. And he had begun to question everything. The heresy began. With a single observation. Pilots who ignored the power-off doctrine and kept their engines running through the landing had better survival rates. It was not supposed to work. Keeping power on meant coming in faster, less controlled, more likely to miss the wires or overshoot. The manuals said so. The instructors said so. Decades of aviation theory said so. But the data, informal, anecdotal, based on Duncan's own observations and quiet conversations with surviving pilots, suggested otherwise. Pilots who maintained partial throttle through the approach had more control. They could compensate for sudden deck drops. They could add power if they started to stall. They had options. The power-off approach left them helpless, committed to a trajectory they could not alter, passengers in their own deaths. Duncan began experimenting, quietly, unofficially. He started signaling select pilots, those he trusted, those with enough experience to handle unorthodox instructions, to keep power on longer, to delay the cut until the last possible second, to think of the landing not as a glide, but as a controlled descent under power, where the throttle was a tool, not an enemy. The results were startling. Pilots following Duncan's method had a crash rate nearly 60% lower than those using the standard approach. 60%. Not a marginal improvement. A revolution. But revolutions, even small ones, are dangerous. When Duncan submitted his findings to the Bureau of Aeronautics in early 1945, the response was glacial. Naval aviation doctrine was not something to be questioned by a single LSO, no matter his experience. The power-off approach had been developed through years of testing. It was backed by engineering data, physics calculations, the collective wisdom of the service. To change it would require rewriting training manuals, recertifying instructors, admitting that the Navy had been teaching a lethal technique for years. The bureaucracy moved slowly. The war moved fast. Duncan, frustrated, began teaching his method, informally. He spoke to pilots in the ready rooms, in the mess, on the flight deck between sorties. He demonstrated with models, sketches, hand gestures. Keep power on until you're sure. Give yourself an out. The deck is not your enemy. Commitment, without options, is. Some listened. Others dismissed him as a crank. But word spread. Pilots talked. And slowly, across the carrier groups in the Pacific, the technique began to take hold. Not through official channels, but through the underground network of men who wanted to live. The transformation was not immediate. Naval aviation, like all military institutions, resisted change with the inertia of a battleship. But by mid-1945, the data was undeniable. Squadrons employing Duncan's power-on approach reported crash rates 70 to 80% lower than those using the traditional method. 70 to 80%. The difference between a meat grinder and a manageable risk. Admirals noticed. Staff officers noticed. The Bureau of Aeronautics, confronted with statistics that could not be ignored, quietly authorized formal trials. By August 1945, revised landing procedures were being distributed fleet-wide. By war's end, the power-on approach had become standard doctrine. No announcement. No press conference. Just a memo, stamped and filed, that changed the way every naval aviator in the world would land for the next 8 decades. George Duncan received a letter of commendation. He was promoted to commander. He never became famous. His name appears in no history books. But the pilots knew, and they lived. What made Duncan's method work was not genius, but humility. The old doctrine assumed that commitment was strength, that a pilot who cut his engine and committed to the landing demonstrated courage and skill. The new doctrine recognized that survival required flexibility, that the pilot, not the manual, was best positioned to judge the final seconds of approach, that keeping power on was not cowardice, but wisdom. It was a fundamentally democratic idea. Totalitarian systems, German, Japanese, Soviet, prized discipline and adherence to doctrine above adaptability. Pilots were taught to follow orders, execute procedures, trust the system. Deviation was failure. Questioning was weakness. The Luftwaffe, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, Both produced brilliant pilots, aces who performed extraordinary feats of skill and courage. But their systems were rigid. Once doctrine was established, it calcified. To change required admitting error, and authoritarian structures do not admit error. The United States Navy, for all its flaws, allowed for heresy. Not easily, not quickly, but eventually. A junior officer could challenge decades of doctrine, and if the data supported him, the system would adapt. It was messy, it was slow, it violated hierarchies and ruffled egos, but it worked. That adaptability, that willingness to be wrong, to learn, to change, was the secret weapon no enemy could counter. The symbolism of Duncan's reform was the throttle itself. The throttle, a simple lever, controlling engine power, the heartbeat of the aircraft. In the old doctrine, the throttle was abandoned at the final moment, cut, silenced, discarded in favor of gravity and faith. In the new doctrine, the throttle remained in the pilot's hand until the very end. Power, under control, options until the last second. Agency over fate. It was a metaphor for the broader conflict. The Axis powers, in their rigid hierarchies and centralized control, had cut their own throttles years before. They had committed to a trajectory, total war, conquest, domination, and once committed, could not adjust. When their initial strategies failed, they had no second plan, no flexibility, no ability to adapt. They rode gravity and momentum down into collapse. The Allies, by contrast, kept power in reserve. They argued, they bickered, they questioned orders and tested alternatives and made mistakes and corrected them. Churchill clashed with Roosevelt. Eisenhower overruled Montgomery. Nimitz adapted tactics based on feedback from junior officers. It was chaotic. It was inefficient. But it worked, because when you keep your hand on the throttle, you can always adjust. You can compensate for the unexpected. You can survive turbulence. You can land safely even when the deck is heaving and the wind is wrong and everything is trying to kill you. That is what democracy does. It keeps power in the hands of those closest to the problem. It trusts the pilot, not just the manual. It builds systems that can learn, and in a long war against enemies who cannot adapt, that is everything. After the war, George Duncan left the Navy. He returned to Iowa, took over his father's farm, raised corn and soybeans, and 4 children. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he would shrug and say, "I just did my job." He died in 1982 at the age of 69 of a heart attack while repairing a tractor. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his Navy service in a single line. It did not mention the thousands of pilots who lived because of his stubbornness, his observation, his willingness to question authority when authority was wrong. But in Pensacola, at the Naval Air Station where carrier pilots still train, there is a plaque, small, bronze, easily missed. It reads, "In memory of LCDR George Duncan, LSO, whose innovations in carrier landing procedures saved countless lives. Keep power until you're sure." Every naval aviator walks past it on the way to the flight line. Most do not notice, but some do, and they carry that lesson with them into the sky. The statistics compiled decades later tell the story in cold numbers. Between 1942 and mid-1945, carrier deck accidents killed approximately 8,500 American pilots. After the adoption of the power-on approach, that rate dropped by 80%. 80%. Not gradually, not over years. Within months, 8,500 men, most barely into their 20s, blown apart, drowned, burned alive, not by the enemy, but by a doctrine that prioritized theory over reality, commitment over flexibility, tradition over survival. And then one man said, "What if we're wrong?" That question saved lives. Thousands of them. It kept pilots in the air, kept carriers operational, kept the pressure on Japan through the final brutal months of 1945. It meant that more planes flew, more sorties, that more targets were struck, that the war ended sooner. It is impossible to quantify exactly how many lives Duncan's innovations saved, directly and indirectly, in combat and out. But the number is not small, and yet he is forgotten. There are no movies about George Duncan, no best-selling biographies, no dramatic reenactments. His story does not fit the narrative of heroism that wars demand. He did not charge a machine gun nest. He did not go down with his ship. He simply stood on a platform with paddles in his hands and thought, there must be a better way. That humility, that quiet refusal to accept unnecessary death, is the most profound form of courage. The Pacific, in autumn, is a vast and indifferent place. The swells roll on, unbroken from horizon to horizon. The sky is empty. The war is over. The carriers have gone to scrap yards or museums, their decks silent, their catapults cold. The men who flew from them are old now or dead, their stories fading into the gray static of history. But the lesson endures. Landing on a carrier is still one of the most dangerous things a pilot can do. The margin for error is still measured in feet and fractions of seconds. The ocean is still unforgiving, but the crash rate today is a fraction of what it was in 1944. Modern pilots train using simulators, fly planes with fly-by-wire systems, and automated landing aids benefit from decades of incremental improvements in technique and technology. But at the core, the principle remains. Keep power on. Maintain control. Give yourself options. Trust the pilot. That principle, born from one man's refusal to accept that death was inevitable, is now woven into the fabric of naval aviation. It is taught in the classroom, practiced on the carrier, internalized until it becomes instinct. And every time a pilot traps successfully, every time a plane catches the wire and jerks to a stop, and the pilot breathes and unbuckles and climbs out alive, George Duncan's ghost is there, paddles in hand, nodding approval. War is often remembered for its grand moments, the invasions, the battles, the speeches, the photographs of flags raised on mountaintops and soldiers kissing nurses in Times Square. We remember the heroes, the aces, the generals, the men whose names are carved into monuments. But wars are also won in quieter ways, by the mechanic, who improves an engine seal, by the clerk who streamlines supply logistics, by the cook who prevents disease with better sanitation, by the LSO who saves lives by questioning a manual. These stories do not make headlines. They do not inspire movies, but they matter. They matter more, perhaps, than the grand gestures, because they speak to something deeper. The recognition that every life is worth saving, that no death is acceptable if it can be prevented, that the system exists to serve the people, not the other way around. George Duncan understood this. He stood on a deck in the middle of an ocean, surrounded by fire and salt and wind, and he saw young men dying for no good reason, and he decided to do something about it. Not because he was ordered to, not because there was glory in it, but because it was right. That is the lesson. Not tactics, not technology, but the fundamental belief that life is precious, that death should not be casually accepted, that the way things are is not necessarily the way things must be. Democracy, at its best, is built on that belief. It allows for dissent. It tolerates inconvenient questions. It changes when confronted with evidence. It admits error. It learns, and in 1945, in the skies over the Pacific, that belief saved thousands of lives. The throttle stayed in the pilot's hand. Power remained an option. And men came home who otherwise would have died. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Somewhere, tonight, a carrier plows through dark water. A plane descends toward the deck, gear down, hook extended, the pilot's hand firm on the throttle. The LSO watches, calm, experienced, paddles ready. The deck heaves, the wind gusts, and the pilot keeps power on, adjusting, compensating, maintaining control until the very last second. The hook catches, the plane stops. The pilot breathes, and in that breath is the legacy of a man who refused to let courage be confused with suicide, who understood that survival is not weakness, who believed that the system could be better, and then made it so. The ocean remembers nothing, but we do, and as long as we remember, the lesson lives. Keep power on, stay in control, give yourself a chance, land safely, go home, live. That is the victory George Duncan won. Quiet, uncelebrated, absolute, and it endures.